My name is Jerry Croth, and I'm an associate professor emeritus from Santa Clara University in psychology. I'd like to start this talk with a journey to the past. So just take a look at these pictures and give me your emotional reactions. Just think about what feelings you have when you see this. That's a Ronald Reagan selling Chesterfield cigarettes and advising his friends to send cartons of cigarettes to their friends for Christmas. Nothing does it like 7-Up. We have the youngest customers in the business. Heinz ketchup. You mean a woman can open it? Now, when I show this picture to undergraduate classes, they just kind of roar and moan and say, oh my God, we've come such a long way. Those were the backward days of the 50s, of the 60s. I mean, talk about unsophisticated, no sense of feminism at all. So the purpose of today's lecture is to say we haven't come very far at all. In fact, we're not even sure we have made any steps forward, because the level of delusion and misperception about the world and ignorance is legion and is growing. That's the subtext of today's talk. So there was a movie called The Matrix, and there's a computer programmer named Neo. Neo lives in this world that is pristine and white and orderly, but he's smart, and he's detected some kind of a computer program that he's mystified by. It's called the Matrix. And it turns out that, by the way, he wants to meet the man who has something to do, who will explain this to him. His name is Morpheus. Morpheus is about ready to tell Neo that he lives in a hallucination, that he lives in a world controlled by the Matrix, in which all of his perceptions are organized by this computer program, and the real world doesn't look anything like the world that he lives in. In fact, the real world is kind of negative. So here's Morpheus talking to Neo.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window, or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
So let's take a look at the Matrix. A few preliminary facts before we walk inside the Matrix, the real Matrix in our lives. First of all, kids spend 45 hours a week in screen time. That is TV, internet, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The average American now spends 9 hours per day using the media. 50% of American children from 8 to 18 report the TV is on in their home constantly. So are we dumbing ourselves down? Are we in a trance? I think Both of those things are probably true. 90% of fourth graders in a survey could not identify a photograph of Abraham Lincoln. 25% of 17-year-olds could not identify who was the head of Germany in World War II. Duh. 30% of high school students did not know how long it took the Earth to orbit the Sun. So, in a way, we are losing contact with that aspect of reality. However, there is another point of view here. 75% of 17-year-olds knew what city was in the zip code 90210. Remember that television show, 90210? They watched it. They live in that fantasy world. Their screen time is devoted to it. They know all about the fantasy world that they live in. 96% of American school children can identify Ronald McDonald, so they are smart, but they're smart about the Matrix and what the Matrix gives us to live in, and we're losing contact with the reality that surrounds our lives. So I wrote a book, and this book contains elements of propaganda tools. In this talk, we're going to talk about 4 propaganda tools that are used by the Matrix. There are many. We're just going to talk about 4. Reframing, repeated affirmations, vicarious or imitative learning, distraction, and denial. Let's take the easiest, reframing. This is putting into fresh words something that is not particularly nice. Taking a bad thing and making it sound good with words. If you remember Newspeak, this was a book by George Orwell, 1984. There was a whole building devoted to the rewriting of history, so that all the bad things in the world were changed to make them sound good. So that is what Newspeak was in 1984. And here's an example of Newspeak, which is reframing. Take a look at George Bush's environmental record, just some facts. He cut gasoline mileage requirements so that a car could have less miles per gallon, not more. He approved offshore and deep water drilling projects. He rescinded rules on diesel emissions. He weakened rules on protecting rivers from pollution, from logging, grazing, and farming. He weakened air pollution standards on the control of nitrogen oxide, mercury, and sulfur dioxide. So imagine you go up to somebody on the street and say, how do you feel about the plan to allow more mercury in our atmosphere? How do you feel about that? I don't think I like that. How about more nitrogen oxide in the atmosphere? I don't think I support that. Okay, so now we're going to use reframing in Newspeak. And what was that called, that legislation that George Bush engineered these things to accomplish? Okay, that was called the Clear Skies Act and the Clean Water Act. Oh, how do you feel about the Clear Skies Act? I think I like that. How do you feel about the Clean Water Act? I support clean water. So the reality is that the pollution requirements were reduced, but the terms used to describe that legislation were glorious. That's called reframing. That's a propaganda technique. Take another one. There are 55,000 factories in the United States in the last 15 years that closed. They moved to China, they fired their workers, they went to China, Vietnam, Indonesia, mainly to China. Workers in Mexico, now starting wage, when they make cars for, like Chrysler's cars, they earn $5 a day, not $5 an hour. Most of everything that you buy at Walmart is made in China, with people who are earning, on the average, 57 cents an hour. I was in a class and I asked them, how many of you have ever had a job where you earn 75 cents an hour? And not a single person raised their hand. But we're buying products, almost everything in Target and Walgreens or Walmart is made by people who earn that wage. So how do you feel about closing those American factories? I don't think I like that. I don't think that's good for America. So says the person on the street. So what are we going to do? We're going to reframe this and we're going to call it something else. And what we call it is globalization and free trade. How do you feel about free trade? I like free trade. I think free trade is good when it's free. And how about globalization? Oh, globalization sounds modern. It sounds interplanetary. I mean, I think I like that. So those are the terms under which these realities hide. The reality is negative. The propaganda is positive. Let's go to propaganda technique number 2. These get a little harder. This is called repeated affirmations. You say a false thing over and over and over again, and have authoritative voices also say 2 plus 2 is 5. And you keep that up with the governor, the senators, the president, and everybody saying the same falsehood over and over again, and pretty soon it gets assimilated by the population and it is believed. The greatest propagandist of all time probably was Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. This is what he said. Propaganda must therefore always be essential and repetitious. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. Now, I actually found a quotation of George Bush that floored me because it says almost exactly the same thing. See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over to kind of catapult the propaganda. George Bush. That's what repeated affirmations is. Now, before we get into that, as a psychologist, I want to explain one idea to you. A delusion. A delusion is a false premise. It's a false idea about the world. Example, you have a cat, or this guy has a cat, and he sees the cat goes over to the neighbor's house, and he sees the neighbor feeding the cat something. Maybe it's a treat, but he thinks the neighbor is trying to poison his cat, and he's giving his cat poison. And he doesn't like it, and it irritates him, and it bothers him. And a few months later, his cat dies. And he's quite sure that the cat died of some toxic poison that was given to the cat by the neighbor. So he takes the cat for an autopsy. Nothing comes back. Died of natural causes. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe the inspectors. He's looking for weapons of mass destruction. And he has taken his cat again for another inspection. And again it comes back. Sorry, natural causes, no toxins in the blood of this cat. So he is not satisfied, walks over to the neighbor's house, confronts him, and shoots him and kills him. Well, this man is obviously mentally ill, right? And secondly, he's suffering from a paranoid delusion. So we will return to this concept later. But we have collective delusions, not just individuals who suffer from them, nations and people have false premises about the world. Let's take a couple here. The first delusion that Americans suffered from, not everybody, but a lot, that Saddam Hussein orchestrated or had something to do with the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And the second delusion is that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons. Well, we all know that number 2 is false. That was a delusion. He wasn't developing nuclear weapons. Let's take a look at the first delusion, that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. So the lie that substantiates the delusion is that Mohammed Atta, it is alleged by the Bush administration, he was a 9/11 hijacker. He went to Prague on April 9th, 2001, before 9/11, and he met with an Iraqi intelligence official there. This was very critical. Everybody was mystified. Why is George Bush attacking Saddam Hussein when we all know it was bin Laden? Why is he going there instead of there? Well, part of the case was that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, and that case was being built and being built and being built. Now, the truth of the matter is that Mohammed Atta never went to Czechoslovakia or Prague. He was in Sarasota, Florida, through the whole period of time. He was making calls on his cell phone on April 6th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. He used his ATM card and was photographed on April 4th. He just never went to Czechoslovakia. That was a complete falsehood or a lie, or whatever. But it was essential to the Bush administration to make the case that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. So you have to repeat the propaganda this way. So it was repeated. George Bush. This is a man who has got connections with Al-Qaeda. He's talking about Saddam Hussein. He's a threat, Saddam Hussein, because he's dealing with Al-Qaeda. Really. We're taking the fight to those that attacked us. Well, Saddam Hussein didn't attack us. Cheney. He did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service in Czechoslovakia last April, several months before the attack. Not true, Mr. Cheney. The 9/11 Commission said that wasn't true. The Czech police said that wasn't true. And guess what? The FBI had Mohammed Atta's cell phone records. They knew he was in Sarasota, Florida. He never was there. So if you keep repeating it over and over again, as they were doing just before we went to war with Iraq, it starts to settle into the national psyche.
Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda.
There was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
Saddam, Al-Qaeda, Saddam, Al-Qaeda, Saddam, the Al-Qaeda, Saddam, Al-Qaeda.
It is only a matter of time before terrorist states armed with weapons of mass destruction develop the capability to deliver those weapons to U.S. cities.
What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members.
So, as we're developing a certain war hysteria and getting ready to invade, Colin Powell speaks in front of the UN PowerPoint presentation. People went nuts over it. They said, wow, what a great presentation. He made the case that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons, that Saddam Hussein had something to do with Al-Qaeda and so forth. And today, here's the reaction to Colin Powell's speech just before we invaded.
First of all, it should be noted that Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations was theater, a masterful theater, effective theater at the time. Here's a man who has tremendous credibility, who presents himself to the Security Council, to the American people, to the international public, and stares the camera in the eye and says he knows Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
Today, Colin Powell says that was the lowest point in his entire political and military career. He regrets that speech. He thinks that he was wrong, and he's sorry for it. He's one of the few people in the administration to really come out and apologize. Now, it wasn't just the administration spreading and repeating the falsehoods. It was going across the entire country. Okay, these are the main war propagandists who were writing columns, appearing on television, repeatedly saying the same thing over and over again.
Who would tell us the truth.
The rallying around the president, around the flag, and around the troops clearly has begun.
And we're going to win!
You really have to be with the troops to understand that kind of adrenaline rush that they get.
I just want you to know, I think Navy SEALs rock.
The pictures you're seeing are absolutely phenomenal.
When my country is at war, I want my country to win.
Iraqi opposition has faded in the face of American power.
What you're watching here is truly historic television and journalism.
It was absolutely electrifying. They actually had to strap me in with my camera at the back of the plane.
An awesome synchronized killing machine.
There is an inherent bias in the coverage of the American press in general.
Am I slanted and biased? You damn well bet I am.
And proud of it. So the result is this. The delusion that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11 and supporting Al-Qaeda, only right after 9/11 happened, a very small number of Americans believed that to be the case. They thought it was bin Laden. 3 months before we invaded Iraq, that number had gone up to 28%. Okay, so Americans were really starting to believe that maybe Saddam Hussein had something to do with this. 2 years after we had invaded Iraq, a majority of Americans felt that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Now, if you were a regular PBS viewer, and that's where you got the majority of your news, you didn't believe this. A very small minority of PBS people got sucked into this delusion. If you watched Fox News, on the other hand, the figures are astonishing. Almost 60% of Fox viewers believed that Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons and had something to do with 9/11. And I read one study that showed that figure went up to almost 80%. So, 3 years after we were in the war in Iraq, a journalist asks George Bush a question and catches him off guard. He asks him what Saddam Hussein had to do with 9/11. You're going to be surprised at the answer.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
It had nothing to do with the attack on the World Trade Center. So why, Mr. Bush, did we go to war? I thought you said we were going to take the war to those that attacked us. So he didn't have nuclear weapons, and he had nothing to do with 9/11. Two very important delusions that took us to war, in effect. Now, 3 years into the war, a poll was done about U.S. servicemen, soldiers. 90% of them felt that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Well, we have a major disconnect here, okay? Now, there's a consequence of a delusion. The man who went and shot the guy who he thought poisoned his cat, he didn't think that that man had 2 sons, that he had a wife, that he had a father. Grandpa lost his son. The sons lost their father. The wife lost her husband and became a widow. All of those things were not on the mind of the person who went over there and said, "You poisoned my cat, boom, I'm going to kill you." Okay? So the consequences of a delusion are pretty severe. Now, we killed 100,000 people. That's a consensus estimate. In my book, we go through a number of Iraqi body counts and so forth. Some American professors say 600,000 were killed. Others say 86,000 were killed. It's a pretty good estimate that 100,000 people are the number of people that we killed. Now, if you look at that bald head of the guy in front, that's a Notre Dame Stadium that has 100,000 people. That's what 100,000 people look like. Those stories are not told on American television. The Matrix is not paying attention to that. Every one of those people has a mother and a father and maybe a child and a best friend, all of whom are traumatized to the extreme with their death. So here's stuff that the dark side of the delusion is repression and denial. Jung calls this the shadow. These are not gruesome stories. They are, however, painful. The shadow is painful. What is repressed and denied is painful. This does not appear on American television.
حد يضرب المدنيين يعني؟
المدنيين اللي كله على بيت عنا كله مدنيين كله عسكريين كله مدنيين يضربون من الله ينتقم منهم حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل 5 جنازات من جنازات بعد بيت يا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله الله ينتقم منهم الله خلقنا منهم وينك الله وينك الله.
So that's not the stuff that is reported on NBC News. But there are at least 100,000 such stories that are out there that we are not conscious of. One more.
اتفضل يا بوش. شوف هذه المآسي. ترضى بهيك شيء انت؟ ترضى بهيك شيء ظلم؟ انت اكو عندك انسانية؟ اذا عندك انسانية تقدر تشوف طفلة وهي تصيح ماما بابا. وين الانسانية؟ وين الضمير؟ وين الله؟
We know.
So that's a sad ending to a discussion of repeated affirmations and a very poignant example of how propaganda can take us off to war. So our second propaganda technique is called vicarious learning and imitative learning. We're changing gears here. So a few little pieces of research from social psychology. If you're sitting in a room and somebody is shaking their foot, you know, they're going like that on the floor, nervous people do that. If a person does that in a social psychology experiment, they'll have a person be a foot shaker. And they notice that statistically other people start copying that behavior. Suddenly 2 or 3 people in a room of 30 are doing the same thing with their foot. It's like a yawn, it's contagious. If you're a nose puller and you go into and this is a stooge who goes into a social psychology experiment and just is doing this a lot, other people start doing it. And if that stooge was not there, this is statistically less of a chance that people would be nose pulling. So there are things in the brain called mirror neurons. So if I'm sewing like this, certain areas of my brain would light up. If I stop sewing and I watch a movie of someone sewing, very similar areas of my brain light up, as if my brain is going through the motions of the action itself, even though I'm just watching the action. Do you follow me? So that's essential. That's neuroscience, but behaviorism has also come up with 2 very important rules about vicarious learning. If there is a positive role model that you identify with, you're male, he's male, you're 18, he's 18, and he's doing something positive that's rewarded, you'll have a tendency to copy that behavior. Negative role models elicit negative behaviors. If the guy is 18, you're 18, he's doing something socially unacceptable, but he's getting rewarded for it, then you have a tendency to repeat that and copy that behavior. Just a small statistical tendency to do that. It's called imitation. So, take a look at positive role models. In 1985, The Cosby Show appeared. He was an obstetrician. She was an attorney. Their kids were all college bound. They were very, very interested in their homework. It was a funny show. Everybody liked this show. It was on from 1985 to 1992. Martin Luther King's widow said this was the most positive portrayal of an African American family ever in the history of American television. So it was positive, and all sorts of positive things happened out in the world. They mentioned Morehouse College in this program, that the kids were going to apply to go to Morehouse College, which was a historically black university. So in reality, Morehouse College experienced a 37% increase in their enrollments during the Cosby period. This is called the Huxtable effect. They were called the Huxtables. Sidney Poitier never made a movie where he played a thug, a criminal, a promiscuous person. He was always a righteous dude, and he had plenty of opportunities to play criminals. And he probably could have made a great deal of money doing it, but he never wanted to portray a negative image to his African American community. He made 35 movies. So, negative imitative learning, on the other hand, works the other way. If you see a model do something and they are rewarded for it, you tend to copy it. A Beavis and Butthead show, they were watched by children. And he said, fire is cool. Well, a little boy in Ohio experimented with fire and burned his house down and killed his 2-year-old sister. There was a movie called Gone in 60 Seconds. That audio is not too good, but I'm going to have to erase that. So the point of this movie here is that Nicolas Cage is stealing cars and can steal them in 60 seconds. And not only does he get the car, but he also gets Angelina Jolie. So they're engaged in negative behavior, and that negative behavior is reinforced. So in reality, it spills over. On the weekend after the movie played in Burnaby, Canada, car theft increased 60%. So there is a phenomena here that's true. Now, the most major effect of negative imitative learning comes from Columbine massacre, the largest massacre in American high school history. Two guys, Klebold and Harris, I think they're sophomores in high school. They feel picked on, they feel bullied, and they're listening to certain kinds of input from the Matrix. First of all, they like to play the video game Doom. Doom is a game where you're simulating people coming into corridors and you're shooting them as they walk into a corridor. That's pretty much exactly what they did in Columbine. The game Doom was nothing more than a simulation of what happened in Columbine in reality. They liked Marilyn Manson's music. Here's a lunchbox from Marilyn Manson. The big bully tried to stick his finger in my chest, try to tell me he's the best. But I really don't give a good goddamn because I got my lunchbox and I'm armed real well. Next Mudadada, I'm going to get my medal. Pow, pow, pow. I decided not to swear here. Now imagine a high school workshop where, if I asked people, how many of you were bullied in junior high school? How many of you were bullied in elementary school? And probably half of a college audience will say they were bullied. All right, fine. How do you deal with bullying? Well, if you go to a school counselor, the school counselor will talk to you about positive confrontation, talk about whistleblowing, talk about dealing with the things intelligently and rationally. Or you can have a workshop sponsored by the David Geffen, who's the major man behind Marilyn Manson. And imagine these people coming to a high school saying, listen, the best way to deal with bullying is to bring a gun to school in your lunchbox and wipe those guys out. Think about it. That is a reasonable thing to do. Okay, that's what's happening here. Now, there's a final propaganda element here, which is the movie Basketball Diaries that came out in 1995, 4 years before Columbine. This had a major influence on these two boys. Notice in this movie, DiCaprio, he's basically having a fantasy. He walks into his high school wearing a trench coat. Now, Klebold and Harris also got trench coats. They called themselves the Trench Coat Mafia, and they identified with this hero, if you want to call him a hero. So he's about ready to walk in and waste the people who've been bullying and humiliating him in high school. But the most important thing is what we usually miss, and that is he's cheered on by some people here in the classroom. So as he's wiping out, look, see the cheering? See the high-fiving? That is a reinforcer to a behaviorist. That means that if you do this behavior, you're likely to be reinforced as well. It all happens at pretty much of an unconscious level. There it is. There's your high five. So Klebold and Harris are, it's hard to call them victims, isn't it? Because they killed 11 people, including themselves, and wounded 24 others, including a teacher. But if you add up the media influences that were impacting these tender, borderline minds, they were very, very powerful. And you can't really talk about understanding how the Columbine massacre occurred unless you're willing to talk about the media, or what we're calling here the Matrix. Now, hip-hop and imitative learning is another element. Sometimes it's positive, but it's generally turning to be negative. In hip-hop, we see a huge, huge change in the nature of the music industry, and it filters its way into language, into styles, and it touches children and affects how they dress, how they talk, what their values are. So let's take a moment here to go back to 1900. Here was America's racist past. People wrote books about black males. This is done by an American sociologist. Black men were portrayed then as innately savage, animalistic, destructive, and criminal, deserving punishment, maybe even death. This brute is a fiend, a sociopath, an antisocial menace. Black brutes are depicted as hideous, terrifying predators who target helpless victims, especially white women. Charles Smith was a writer in the 1890s who said a bad Negro is the most horrible creature upon the earth, the most brutal and merciless. So there was a movie made, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is considered part of America's racist past, one of our first really racist movies. So we think, oh my God, that's in the past. How nice that that's over. That's out of American history. Things have changed, and this racism is no longer tolerated in our society. Welcome to 50 Cent. 50 Cent appears in the 21st century, and he's pointing a gun at you, and he's actually acting out the image of the black, savage, animalistic, sadistic male that was portrayed 110 years ago. Here are the lyrics to a song of his, a very popular song called Heat. Keep thinking I'm candy. I'm not going to swear in this, so you have to read it. Keep thinking I'm candy till your skull get popped and your brain jump out the top like Jack-in-the-Box. In the hood, summertime is the killing season. It's hot out, this bitch. That's a good enough reason. So think about that. What is he actually saying? He's saying to his girlfriend, you might like me and you might be attracted to me, but I need to forewarn you that I can be moody. And when I'm moody, I could just as easily take out a gun, especially if it's hot, because after all, your moods during the killing season in the summertime, that's when you go out and kill a lot of people. And I just might put that gun into your brain and blow out your brains, and they'll pop out like a jack-in-the-box. That's the kind of guy I am. Okay? You want to dance to this song? You want to dance to this idea? So, what is going on here? Here's a video of Lil Wayne. Lil Wayne, think of this, I turned off the volume. Lil Wayne is doing an infomercial for black males here. He's in Las Vegas. He went gambling. He won a lot of money. He's got a stretch limo. It's all drugs and gambling and dancing and fun and glitter. And like a lollipop is a euphemism for oral sex in this movie. And these women are just throwing themselves on the floor of his limo. This is just, this is the opposite of the Huxtables, okay? This is where everything comes to you easy. It's fun. You don't have to study and go to Morehouse College. Okay, this is a completely different image that is promoted effectively through imitation and vicarious learning. And it has its effect, and it spills over into reality. Now, here are some lyrics from hip-hop songs. On the left, on your left, is the meta meaning of these lyrics. On the right are the actual lyrics. Take a look at Thief. When it's to eat a meal, I rob and steal. Okay, I got the message. Take a look at drug addict. Love to pump crack, love to stay strapped. So these are the lyrics that are coming from modern commercial hip-hop. And if you read down the left-hand column, you come up with exactly the same racist stereotype that they were writing about in 1899. Black male as obscene, a pimp, a thief, a misogynist, a sociopath, violent, drug addict, and promiscuous. So that is an image that is being marketed by the Matrix. Now, these are not all my own ideas. Professor Tricia Rose is an African-American professor from Brown University. She used to love hip-hop. She said that hip-hop used to be really cool. It used to be revolutionary, like Public Enemy. There are some lyrical hip-hop artists like Mos Def and Talib Kweli. But if you follow the money, that's not where the money is. The money is not in that. And since 1996, the Telecommunications Act was passed. And she makes a very important point here. There used to be really cool underground hip-hop labels, Def Jam Records. But when the Telecommunications Act was passed, the big conglomerates started to eat up all of the little labels. Warner Music bought up 40 hip-hop labels, okay? And they became part of the big media conglomerate, part of the Matrix, really. And hip-hop changed because when you follow the money is not taking you to revolutionary hip-hop. It is taking you to this kind of racist, degrading hip-hop that white teenagers really like to hear. The major people who buy hip-hop today are white teenagers. Hip-hop has increased since 1996. It used to be 10% of all record sales. It is now 40% of all record sales. Indie rock, jazz, country have all declined in terms of record sales. Hip-hop has almost quadrupled. Okay? And what is being marketed here is the darkest side, because that is the most commercially viable side. Now, there are a lot of people who have spoken out against the change in hip-hop. Oprah Winfrey says, hip-hop is hate speech with a beat. Winston Marsalis, the jazz trumpeter, is absolutely enraged by it. He says it's nothing more than ancient stereotypes wrapped in contemporary rhyme. Gladys Knight, it's distasteful, vulgar, it has not elevated the African American community, it has lowered our self-esteem. Ashley Judd, with its rape culture and insanely abusive lyrics and depiction of girls and women as hoes, it is the contemporary soundtrack of misogyny. So, if you start looking at positive versus negative role models, some very interesting things come into focus. During the positive years, 1985 to 1982, when the Huxtables are on, SAT scores for black males increased. 75 to 79% of black males graduated from high school on time. Morehouse College had an increase in 37% enrollments. Now, let's flip to after the Telecommunications Act is passed, and when the darker, more sadistic side of hip-hop emerges. Well, Lil Wayne, that's a picture of Lil Wayne. SAT scores go down, and in 2010, only 47% of black males graduate from high school. Black male incarceration rates are up 50% since 1990. Now, some people say, oh, you can't blame hip-hop for these changes in society. Admittedly, we can't prove it, okay, in a court of law. But we, as psychologists, know that these negative images do have a spillover effect into the world. So, I'm going to talk about hip-hop just one more time, but I need to introduce the fourth propaganda technique called distraction and denial. That means look over here. Please don't look over there. We want you to look over here. Look over here, please, because we don't want you to be paying attention to reality. So that's another technique that the Matrix uses, and here's Here's an example. Oh, look at Dr. Dre. Look at Snoop Dogg. How controversial. NWA. Do you know what those letters stand for? Jay-Z. He's worth $400 million. Dr. Dre's worth over $100 million. So is Snoop Dogg. All these stories are being written about these controversial figures who are the major money-making hip-hop artists, including 50 Cent. What are you not seeing here in this picture? Well, what you're not seeing is that after the Telecommunications Act, the big conglomerates bought up all these record labels. Jimmy Iovine is Dr. Dre's manager. Dr. Dre's worth $100 million, but Jimmy Iovine is worth $400 million. And he's in turn owned by Lucien Grange, the CEO of a media conglomerate. There are only 4 major media conglomerates that control 90% of what you hear on the radio and what you can buy in your Sony, Warner, Universal, and so forth. So you notice something. I mean, Snoop Dogg is worth $100 million, but David Geffen is worth $4 billion. Edgar Bronfman is worth $2.5 billion. When you follow the money, you realize, oh my God, hip-hop is a white man's industry. If you want to work in hip-hop, we want you to be obscene, pornographic, play the role of the pimp, a crack addict. That's what sells, that's what we want, that's what we're signing, and that's what we're expecting of you. That image is just simply not in the consciousness of Americans. Hip-hop used to be seen as a grassroots black African-American phenomena. It is no longer. It is a white racist industry that is really promoting the racism of 1899 and selling it to 14-year-old white males who comprise 70% of the hip-hop audience. Another example of distraction and denial. Coca-Cola commercial.
Join Coca-Cola and World Wildlife Fund to help protect it, so the polar bear always has a place to call home. To donate and help create a safe refuge for the polar bear, look for white Coke cans and caps.
Now, doesn't that portray Coca-Cola as one of those green corporations in the world? I mean, they even have a white can. Donate. Every time you buy a Coke, you are contributing to saving the polar bear. Hooray for Coca-Cola. Look over here. Please don't look over there. So what are we not seeing? Well, Coca-Cola, one 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola contains 10 teaspoons of sugar. That's 1 more teaspoon than an adult male's entire recommended daily allowance. And it's way more than that for children. Drinking one 12-ounce can of Coke per day raises your diabetes rate probability 15%. Drinking one 12-ounce can of Coke per day for a year will give you an 18-pound weight gain. 20 years ago, more teenagers drank milk than Coke. Currently, it is the opposite, thanks to the Matrix. Coca-Cola is really a gross polluter. Coca-Cola produces 25 million plastic bottles every day, more than 10 billion a year. A plastic bottle is discarded, it goes into landfills, and guess it takes almost 500 years before that plastic bottle will decompose. So every plastic bottle of Coke that you see is going to be around for another 500 years. Okay, longer than the history of the United States of America. Even after repeated pleas, Coke currently recycles only about 10% of its plastic bottles. Okay, so the commercial gives you the impression that Coke is green. The reality is that Coke is one of the least green corporations on our planet.
The average American child sees 10,000 food advertisements per year on television. 95% of those are for sugared cereals, soft drinks, fast foods, or candy. A parent who eats every meal, every day, for the whole year with their child, and every meal gives a very compelling nutrition message and can bring in cartoon characters and Michael Jordan. So instead of selling McDonald's, he sells oranges. And Britney Spears, instead of selling Pepsi, will sell radishes or lettuce or something. That parent will have 1,000 cracks at their child compared to 10,000 for the food industry. So it's not a fair fight.
You know, by the time kids are able to speak, most of them can say McDonald's.
I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to tell me who they are.
Okay.
Who's that? You don't know?
George Washington.
Yeah? Who is he?
Who the fourth president, he freed the slaves, and he could never tell a lie.
Who's that?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know. George W. Bush?
No, that's a good guess, though. Who is this?
I don't know. Cordero? I forgot the name, but I think I know.
Yeah? Where have you seen her?
That picture's on the side. Wendy.
Nice. Who's that?
McDonald. Ronald McDonald.
Who is it?
McDonald.
What does he do?
He was helping people at the cash register. He works at McDonald's. I love the pancakes and sausage. He brings every of his friends to McDonald's for a Happy Meal.
Where have you seen him?
On television, on the commercials. He's the character that made McDonald. And he does a lot of funny stuff on TV.
So, let's take a look at McDonald's. In 1997, McDonald's was selling about 10 million Happy Meals in a week. Then they decided to try marketing toys with the Happy Meal. Pavlov's conditioning, remember? Ring a bell and the dog salivates? Well, if you're going to have the child come and eat, associate positive things, toys, games, playgrounds, clowns, everything with that. And McDonald's did a lot of research. Tastes form between 4 and 8. So if you can start them out on Coca-Cola and a cheeseburger at 4 or 5, they will like it. Most of them will like it for the rest of their lives. So the whole idea of McDonald's interest in children is the same as Pavlov's interest in dogs. So in Ronald McDonald's world, we have the largest playground manufacturer, the playground owner in the United States. McDonald's owns something like 8,000 playgrounds that are connected to its restaurants. And of course, Happy Meals have watches and toys and glitter. San Francisco is a progressive city that has eliminated the allowing toys to be packaged with a Happy Meal. It's a city ordinance. That's certainly not true for the rest of the country. If we go to the church of Ronald McDonald, in this church, if you want to think of it that way, 90% of American children between 3 and 9 visit McDonald's each month, twice the number that attends church services. So this really does have an impact on the psyches of children. So here are McDonald's 8,000 playgrounds that it owns. And again, the intent is for children to associate good times, happiness, recreation, fun, and glitter with their food. Now, what is inside a McDonald's hamburger? I wanted to find out. I wanted to look for a peer-reviewed study to just find out what are these kids eating. Well, first of all, if you read books like Fast Food Nation, of the way American beef is slaughtered is interesting. Not all beef is slaughtered this way, but probably the vast majority of it. Cows are put in vast, huge feedlots. You can smell them for miles around because they're walking around in excrement. They have excrement in their hoofs, in their intestines, and they're being fattened up for slaughter. There's a place on Highway 5 in California, my daughter calls it Cowschwitz. So a lot of antibiotics are going into that, both for prevention of disease as well as to improve growth. The study that went and bought 8 varieties of burgers from fast food restaurants and then did histological analysis. And of these 8 burgers, 1 was a McDonald's burger. Here are the results. The burgers contained, on average, 49% water and only 12% meat. That's unusual. They contained connective tissue, plant material, cartilage, ground bone, peripheral nerves, and blood vessels. 25% of the samples contained a parasite. So that's a rather big discrepancy from what we see on our television. So Morgan Spurlock did a movie called Super Size Me, and he decided to eat McDonald's burgers, McDonald's food every day, every meal for an entire month. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He ate nothing else except McDonald's. He gained 25 pounds in 30 days. His cholesterol rose 40%. So McDonald's burgers contain fast food. They contain preservatives and chemicals like trimethylbenzene, ethylbenzene, alpha chloroform, BCH. And in order to kill the fecal material that may be present in the beef, it's often injected with ammonia gas. So Spurlock tried an experiment. He wanted to take a bunch of regular fries and put them in a glass container at room temperature on his kitchen sink for 2 months. He did the same with McDonald's French fries in a glass container, unrefrigerated for 2 months. Look at the difference. The regular fries decompose, turn black. The McDonald's fries, after 2 months, look almost completely edible. That's because of all the salt and preservatives that are in that food. So distraction and denial are the 2 propaganda techniques we've talked here in this last section. And that means that the reality of McDonald's and the reality of Coca-Cola is far different than the fantasy world that is created around these 2 products. So that's an illustration of another propaganda technique. Something like 30% of Americans have what is called metabolic disorder: hypertension, high blood pressure, overweight, elevated cholesterol. Every day, 30% of America's children eat fast food. 44% of inner city blacks are obese because there aren't that many good markets in America's inner cities. But there are lots of fast food places. I would like to conclude today's talk by putting some words in Morpheus's mouth. You're going to be Neo, I'm going to be Morpheus. So let's start with the real Morpheus and that.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Yes, Neo, your reality is constructed out of fantasies, electrical signals given to you by the Matrix, through your television, your radio, your smartphone. You live in a trance, Neo, without knowing it. Your psyche is owned by the Matrix, by Disney, Time Warner, Fox, and Ronald McDonald. In 1960, Americans watched television 1.5 hours a day. By 1970, it was 4 hours per day. By the end of the millennium, it was 5 hours a day. Now when we add in Facebook, web surfing, and video games, screen time is the major activity engaged in by Americans outside of sleep and work. And yet no one calls it by its proper name, an addiction. The pusher is the media matrix. It uses its toolbox of reframing, newspeak, repeated affirmations, imitative learning, distraction, and denial to keep our trance in full blossom. On December 8th, Brian Williams, NBC News of the World, told us that movie actor Alec Baldwin was kicked off a plane in Los Angeles. We were shocked, curious for more. Why, we would ask. But Brian wouldn't tell us. He said the story would come after these messages from his sponsors. And even then Alec Baldwin didn't appear. He was a teaser. You had to watch the entire newscast and all the commercials before you got the story that you were fascinated by, the hook, before you could enter more deeply into the fantasy world that Brian provides. That day, 60,000 Russians demonstrated in Red Square about the corruption of the elections in Russia, one of the largest demonstrations since the collapse of communism. But Brian didn't report that story. He was teasing us with the story of Alec Baldwin. Thousands are dying of starvation from the worst drought to impact East Africa in decades. But that wasn't reported either. Brian was still enticing us with the adventures of Alec. More people died in 5 minutes in Haiti's earthquake than all the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. But Brian was there and left right away, as if the addicted American news consumer suffers from ADHD and needs to transition to a new story every 30 seconds. Brian is a marquee in front of a circus which features the bearded woman and the two-headed dog. His job is to keep you entranced and subliminally prepared to buy his products. His colleague, Diane Sawyer, has the same job description. She earns $1 million a month, more than twice what the President of the United States earns in a year. She is valuable, so is Brian. They have a function they perform for the Matrix, which digs ever deeper into our psyches, substituting fantasy, gossip, titillation, commercialism, and propaganda into our minds, masquerading as reality. The Matrix repeats war propaganda, bellowing it from one corner of the nation's airways to the next, until a majority of Americans finally believe they should go off 6,000 miles from their shores and kill 100,000 people, who they mistakenly thought had attacked them on September 11th or were making nuclear weapons. Through sleight of hand, denial, and distraction, the media matrix gives us one side, but not the other. We do not see the corpses, the caskets, the consequences of our delusions. There are 4.5 million orphans in Iraq, 500,000 who live on the streets. There are 700,000 widows in Iraq. We didn't create all of them, but we certainly created many. But Brian and Diane are not doing stories on these subjects. Coca-Cola does not want to underwrite such painful material. Instead, the Matrix entices us, teasing us with their hyped lead stories and hypnotic hooks, Jessica Simpson's pregnancy, Herman Cain's groping, who signed Peyton Manning, or the shocking truth about Whitney Houston's death. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X gave their lives to lift African Americans out of a world of discrimination and recrimination into the dream of equality, pride, and self-respect. But the high priests of hip-hop, that is, white businessmen and their lackeys and employees in blackface, Jay-Z, 50 Cent, Snoop Dogg, reverse a century of progress, serving up racist black stereotypy bedecked in contagious rhythms and stunning visuals. The African American, who is thought of as a drug-dealing, thug, hypersexualized criminal in 1900, has been recreated in hip-hop for your amusement and entertainment, degrading his own sisters and painting his own people in various hues of hate. The Matrix grows in power as America's addictions increase. Little children beg their parents to take them to a Pavlovian conditioning center that offers them a fantasy land of watches, teeny tubbies, and playgrounds where they will consume food that is made up of ground bone, water, and connective tissue, spiced with so many preservatives that even after a month left in the open air, the food fails to decompose. then they will all wash it down with water that contains more sugar in a single can than 3 times the recommended dosage for a child for an entire day. And because they have been conditioned to associate these intense manufactured flavors early in life, when food preferences are formed, they will return like zombies in their trance, loyal customers for the rest of their lives. NBC News of the World Neo is not the news of the world, and it is not entertaining either. As global warming becomes more foreboding, with America and China increasing their carbon emissions every year, 20% of the Earth's population living on less than $1 a day, 1 in 6 persons on the planet living in a slum. The job of the Matrix is to keep us cocooned from reality, comfortable in our couch-potato trance, distracted, in denial, marginalized by delusion, mesmerized by illusion, and passionately waiting to find out whatever happened to Alec Baldwin.